And to discuss the prospects for the Romney-Ryan ticket, we're joined now from Cambridge, Massachusetts by Roger Porter, Professor of Business and Government at the Harvard Kennedy School. He was a senior economic advisor in the Reagan and Ford administrations and has known Mitt Romney for many years. Roger Porter, thanks for being there.
My pleasure. Delight to be with you.
How radical a choice was Paul Ryan as Mitt Romney's running mate?
I wouldn't describe it as a radical choice at all. Paul Ryan is a very experienced, savvy young man. He first made his way to Congress at the age of 28. He's been there 14 consecutive terms, or 14 consecutive years. He has a lot of experience on budget matters, which is the key issue on which the election is going to revolve. He has a lot of experience working with Republicans in the Congress. He has a lot of experience working with Democrats, and he has a set of ideas and plans that can help illuminate the choices that we face as a country. So I think in those respects, he's an excellent choice, and I certainly wouldn't describe him as radical.
Yeah, Newt Gingrich, the Conservative who led the Republican Revolution in the Clinton era, certainly thinks he's radical. He described his budget plan as right-wing social engineering. Doesn't that indicate that at least some Republicans will regard this as a strange choice?
Well, Newt has apologized for that characterization, and after thinking about it, decided that it was a little over the top, as sometimes happens during the course of commentary and campaigns. But what Paul Ryan and Mitt Romney have done is drawn attention to the fact that we are running and have been running massive federal government deficits in recent years, and that they believe there is a real need to redress this situation through tax reform and through restraining the rate of growth of government spending.
Why do you think Romney has gone for a man who is regarded as something of a darling of the Tea Party movement?
Mitt Romney's the only one who knows precisely the reasons why he chose Paul Ryan. I do know that they have great personal chemistry. They've spent a good deal of time with one another on the campaign trail. They complement one another in interesting ways. Mitt Romney's experience is almost exclusively in the private sector, running big organizations like Bain Capital, the Salt Lake Olympics, and serving for a term as a state governor. Paul Ryan's experience is all in Washington, in the legislative branch, dealing with federal government budgetary matters. So when you look at the combination of them, they tend to complement one another in interesting and important ways. And at the same time, they share a philosophy that we need to have a streamlined set of government programs so that we can develop a large number of private sector jobs and rejuvenate the U.S. economy.
Yeah, the theory is that Romney's campaign has been struggling to define itself, and what we now appear to have is a kind of stark contrast between two very different visions of America and its economy, the Romney-Ryan vision and, of course, the Obama vision. The question is Romney's vision going to be as radical as Ryan's vision? We'll talk in a minute about the detail of his budget-cutting proposals, but will Romney go that far?
Well, as you can imagine in any political campaign, each side tries to define the other. And certainly there has been a host of advertising put on by the Obama campaign to try to describe and define Romney and Ryan as very radical, etc. They do have a quite different vision than the current administration's, and I think it will be an opportunity for Americans to have a real choice about the particular path that they would like to see the economy on. Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan are very much into focusing on economic growth and prosperity. President Obama has spent a good deal of his time in administration working on trying to redivide the pie up in different ways and to seek greater equality among those who are receiving government largesse. And therefore you get a very growth-oriented team and a very quality-oriented team.
Let's have a look at the famous Ryan budget plan a little bit. You talk about Obama expanding the pie. If anything, Ryan wants to shrink the pie, at least the government spending side of it. So he's planning to undo much of the social safety net that currently exists, severely cutting two key programs, Medicare and Medicaid, which effectively subsidise health care to elderly and poor Americans, while at the same time giving a very big tax cut to the wealthiest Americans. Do you think Romney will go as far as that? Will he follow the kind of prescriptions that Ryan is setting out?
Well, I don't think that's an accurate characterization of what Romney or Ryan are proposing. We've taken federal spending, which historically has been at about 20% of our gross domestic product, and it's now up at 25%. And what Paul Ryan and Mitt Romney and others are proposing is taking it from the levels that it is now and back to what have been our more historical norms. That means that Medicare, Medicaid, and other programs are going to have to reduce the rate of growth by which we are increasing the spending. But that is a very different proposition than making massive cuts in those programs. Likewise,
well, can I sort of interrupt you there
tax
for a moment? Can I just interrupt you just on this question of Medicaid? Because this is the program which pays for health care for the poorest Americans. Now, his cuts, and they are cuts, are pretty drastic, and they start much sooner than the cuts proposed for Medicare. He wants to cut $1.4 trillion from Medicaid between 2013 and 2022, which would stop 11 million people getting access to that program. Now, those figures come from the Congressional Budget Office, so they are severe cuts.
Well, first of all, you need to understand the way in which Medicaid works. It is a program which is shared between the federal government and the states. About half of the spending comes from the federal government, about half of the spending comes from the states. What Paul Ryan is proposing is reducing the rate of growth of the federal contribution, while at the same time giving states more flexibility in how those funds are allocated or spent. So it is not clear. It is clear that there will be a reduced rate of growth of federal contributions to Medicaid. It is not clear what will happen with respect to the behavior of state governments, who are the ones that actually administer the program and who come up with roughly half the funding on their own.
Well, I mean, what's clearly the case here is that he's asking $1.4 trillion to be funded by the states who currently aren't funding that much.
No, he's calling for a reduction in the rate of growth of spending, which would reduce that rate of growth of spending by about $140 billion a year over a 10-year period. The question is, what is going to happen with respect to the way in which those programs are administered? Everybody agrees that there's a huge amount of waste and inefficiency in the way in which the programs are currently run, and that the states will have to decide how they want to utilize those funds best to treat the rising number of people who are Medicaid beneficiaries.
How do you think the American voters are going to cope with this notion of very large tax cuts to the richest Americans while simultaneously cutting the programs that aid the health of the poorest?
Well, actually, when you talk about tax cuts, what Romney and Ryan are proposing is reducing a large number of tax loopholes or benefits that people who itemize their taxes, which tend to be the wealthiest Americans, and in exchange for taking away those deductions, reducing marginal rates. Therefore, until one knows the details, which have not been disclosed yet, of which deductions will come in order to have this essentially be revenue neutral, we won't know exactly how this is going to affect particular income groups.
Okay, briefly, at the same time they're pledging not to touch the defence budget, which, thanks largely to America's two big wars, have blown out to $775 billion a year. Do you think the Romney team has got its priorities right here to leave defence alone effectively?
Well, the way in which we budget in defense is that we have a regular defense budget, and then we have been passing supplementals in order to finance the operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. Those supplementals, as those wars wind down, will go away. And what Romney and Ryan are looking at is what are we going to do with the core defense budget and how much are we going to allow it to grow. So what they have proposed at this stage is that we're not going to have massive cuts in defense spending, but there will be adjustments made as the wars wind down, obviously, in the number of supplementals that are advanced.
Okay, finally, the polls on the Ryan announcement have been rather mixed. How much, in reality, will Paul Ryan influence the course of this election over the next 12 weeks? And how do you think it's going to play out yourself?
Historically, vice presidential candidates matter relatively little in the general election. People don't say, I like or dislike the vice presidential candidate, but I like or dislike the presidential candidate, and so I'm going to vote for the presidential candidate. That is simply not the way in which, at least in past elections, most voters have behaved. I think he will help to energize the base of the Republican Party, which will be an asset to the ticket. But in terms of having a big major impact, the impact is going to be on voters' assessment of the person at the top of the ticket, in this case, Governor Romney.
And finally,
I think it will be a very...
Yeah, that was my question.
I think it will be a very close election. I think it will be a very close election. The polling data that we have now suggests that more Americans have made up their minds about who they intend to vote for at this stage of the campaign than in almost any past election in the last 50 years. So voters tend now, in the absence of some big cataclysmic event, to be pretty solidified. The number of people who are still making up their minds is less than 10% of the electorate. At least that's what they disclose to pollsters. And so I think, given the fact that the polling now shows it very close between the Republican and Democratic tickets, we're likely to see another very close election come November between these two tickets.
With a record amount of money being spent trying to influence 10% of the voters.
The amount of money being spent in this campaign is astronomical. In part, it's because we now have so-called super PACs, which are not tied to the campaigns, which the campaigns cannot control, and which can put on virtually unlimited amounts of advertising in terms of the number of dollars that can be raised. And both sides have been raising huge amounts of money. So television viewers in the swing states are given an enormous number of ads that they see every day. One wonders how much that actually moves voters, but there's certainly an enormous amount of advertising going on the television these days.
Roger Porter, we thank you very much for taking the time to come and talk to us tonight on Late Line.
My pleasure. Thank you.